And this will be sort of part one of that discussion or that exploration. And then in a couple of weeks, every year, the legislature receives a formal report on the Farm to Plate program. That will be coming up later. I'm not sure when exactly.
May 6th.
Okay. So with us today, Ellen, why don't you introduce your team, and then we will go around the table and introduce ourselves to you, and then we get started.
Great. So for the record, Ellen Kaler, I am the executive director at the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund. We administer the Vermont Farm to Plate Investment Program is its formal name as in statute. And I've been at the Jobs Fund for 17 years now. And we've been managing the Vermont, the Farm to Plate Investment Program since 2009. So we'll be doing that. And this is...
For the record, Jake Claro, Farm to Plate Director at the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund.
And then we have...
Oh yeah, we're observing. I am Becca Warren. I'm the Food Security Plan Project Manager at the Jobs Fund, part of the network staff.
And I'm Kelly Dolan. I'm the network manager for Farm to Plate.
Great. And do we have anybody else on sitting in remotely who would like to be introduced?
Maybe just have Christina introduce herself.
Okay. Christina?
Hi, thank you. I'm Christina Sweet, and I'm the Agricultural Development Division Assistant Director at the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. Thank you.
Nice to meet you. So we'll introduce ourselves, and I think you've probably met some of the folks around the table here because we do have a handful of returning members, but we have a lot of new members. We're a bigger committee and we have a lot of new members. But why don't we start with Representative Supernaut, and we'll just go around and you can say what you think would be relevant, I think, for the visitors to know.
Sure. So hi folks, Representative Heather Supernaut, Vice Chair. I am down in Central Vermont, Barnard, Pomfret, and Bridgewater, and I'm an organic vegetable and dairy farmer.
Hi, I'm Esme Cole, and I represent Windsor 6, which is Hartford, Vermont. And I have a teeny bit of experience with the Farm to Plate program through the Vermont Department of Health.
Okay.
Cool.
John O'Brien, Windsor Orange 1. I represent Royalton. I'm in hometown Tunbridge and grew up on a sheep farm and still live there.
Mike Rice, I represent the Bennington Rutland District, Dorset, Danby, Landgrove, Mount Tabor, and Peru. I have worked for the last few years and still, as much as the schedule allows, work for the Massachusetts chapter of NOFA.
Oh, great.
And have worked on farms around the state and restaurants growing up too.
Cool.
Great.
So I'm David Templeman, Representative David Templeman from Orleans 3. That's Barton, Brownington, and Westmore. I'm a regenerative sheep farmer.
Okay.
Henry Pearl from Danville. I represent Danville, Peacham, and Cabot, and I'm an organic dairy farmer.
I'm Jed Lipsky, rep from Lamoille 1, known as Stowe. I'm the outlier in this committee. I have been a lifelong logger and manage timberlands and harvest timber.
Rodney Graham, represent Orange 3, which is most of Williams down in Chelsea. And I'm the troublemaker.
Don't believe him.
He's the longest.
Well, we know.
Yeah, he's familiar. That's
familiar. David Durfee. I live in Shaftesbury and represent Shaftesbury, Glastonbury, and part of Sunderland. And previously managed a food co-op, and for a number of years, and I'm not sure how this started, but I got a weekly email from the Farm to Plate program, which was great. It was aimed at retailers and Vermont retailers, and I was in Massachusetts, but it was really helpful. So I said, oh yes, I know that program.
I know the newsletter you're referring to.
Yes.
It's called Small Bites.
Yeah.
Bites.
Yeah. Which everyone's welcome to see, I think, probably.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Get enough email and you want. So, yeah, why don't you, or John, did you want to?
Just, Ellen, at some point, can you, just sort of explain where the Jobs Fund sits in the universe that we deal with, because you did a great job explaining it to me last year.
Sure, happy to. Yeah. So the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund is considered an independent 501c3 nonprofit. However, we were actually birthed by the legislature in 1995. The legislature at the time thought that it would be valuable for the state to have an entity outside of formal state government that worked on sustainable economic development and tasked us with 5 specific economic sectors. So while the Department of Economic Development, for instance, has to, in essence, be all things to all economic sectors, we have been tasked with working on agriculture and food systems, forest products. We have a forest products program. Christine McGowan is our staff member, met with you recently. We also renewable energy, green technology, and then waste pollution abatement. So think composting and more trying to get the waste streamed in manufacturing to be thought of in the design process before things get created as waste. So those are the 5 lanes that we travel in. In statute, because we have a statute that governs us or guides us really, we have an 11-person board of directors. On the board by statute is the Secretary of Agriculture or designee, the Secretary of Commerce or designee, and the governor gets to choose 1 seat. And right now, that seat is held by Dustin Degree, the Deputy Commissioner of Department of Labor. So Secretary Tebbett serves and Deputy Secretary Tate Brooks serves on our board. And then we have 8 members that are, the board basically appoints. So Representative Laura Sibilia just joined our board, for instance. For 9 years, Representative Robin Scheid was on our board. So we have this very interesting sort of quasi nonprofit-y, government-y kind of relationship with the state of Vermont. We receive about a quarter of our budget comes through is general appropriations dollars that come through the state of Vermont, through the Agency of Agriculture or the Agency of Commerce in the form of a grant agreement. It's written, we request each year as part of their budget exercise a dollar amount. They then put that into their budget request to the governor's office, and then it flows through the governor's request. So I also serve on the Working Lands Enterprise Board by statute. So if there's some minor questions about the Working Lands Enterprise Program, I'm happy to address what I can, if not the Agency of Ag doing so. And I also serve on the Governor's Commission on the Future of Agriculture. I was appointed by the governor to serve in that capacity. And is there another one I'm on? I'm not remembering.
The answer is probably yes.
And I'm also part of a 6-state regional initiative with the farm to plate counterparts in the other 5 New England states. We have a project called New England Feeding New England, and it's an initiative to try to get 30% of the food that New Englanders consume to be produced from within New England states. So I can also speak to sort of the regional marketplace and likely will be coming back to talk to you more specifically about that project in a while, and not so much today. So we have very, very strong relationships with the Agency of Agriculture, the Agency of Commerce. One of the things that was so unique in 2009 when the Farm to Plate Investment Program was created, again by an act of this body, was to understand that agricultural development is it is a form of economic development. And so back in 2009, when the legislature was considering creating this program, there was actually, it was a very unique situation in that there was always some member from the House Commerce Committee who sat in House Ag Committee when there was discussion and testimony and they were working on the bill language. And somebody from House Ag that went into the Commerce Committee when it was their turn to look at the bill. So they really passed that bill. And this also happened on the Senate side as well. They really saw themselves doing this program together. Because of the strong economic impact that the food system has on the state. In total, there are over 64,000 Vermonters that work within the food system. It's about $11.3 billion worth of economic activity in the state. Vermonters when we first dug into starting this initiative, we estimated that Vermonters were only consuming about 5% local food. That's what we could gather from the data. Over the 10-year period of the first Farm to Plate strategic plan, because this one is actually the second, during the first one, we set a target whereby 10% of our local food, Vermonters would be consuming 10% from local sources. In fact, in 7 years, we surpassed that. And when we did our local food counts in 2020, we were at 16%. So that represented a 225% increase in Vermonters stepping up and consuming more local food. When Farm to Plate was first being formulated back in 2009, what was going on in the agricultural sector was there was a big crisis in conventional dairy. Dairy prices were just totally tanking. And there was a lot of concern about, as there is still today, how do we maintain and sustain our conventional and organic dairy community? And so there was a lot of kind of down. It was really a down energy of what was going on. And there was a lot of legislators who were like, dairy's dead. Let's just throw in the towel. It's done, right? And because also at that same time, there was a lot more activity around farm to school, community supported agriculture, farmers markets, restaurants, the whole Vermont Fresh network of getting more farm to table type restaurants were on the rise. So there was this very strange situation going on where you had dairy really struggling. And then you had all of this excitement, lots of new farmers, lots of young people, women getting into farming, a lot of people, first generation farmers, like people even intentionally going into farming when that wasn't the family that they came from. Like there was no history of family farming. And so there was this dichotomy, and the legislators at the time were just like, what is going on? We cannot make sense of this. So they asked our organization to do a strategic planning process to talk with people all across the state to find out, what do you think we should do? What should we be investing in? What kinds of dollar investments should we make? What kind of policy changes should we make? And so over the course of 18 months, in 2009 and 10, we talked to over 1,500 Vermonters. We held summits all around the state. We had focus groups on certain topics. We did a pretty extensive survey that anybody could give input on. We did a lot of actual hard research looking at the data, and we married the data with what we were hearing from folks in communities. And so the first Farm to Plate plan, 10-year plan, was released in January of 2011, right at the start of the Shumlin administration. And it was really embraced by not only both legislative bodies, but by the governor's office, by his administration. We worked very closely with Secretary Chuck Ross and with Secretary Lawrence Miller at the time. So we then started to implement what was the recommendations in that plan. There were a number of legislative initiatives during that 10-year period that arose out of ideas that came out of that plan, and a lot of strengthening of programs that were maybe earlier stage and smaller during the first 10 years of this 100-year period, but needed scaling. So more money into farm to school, more exploration of not just K through 12 schools, but getting into hospitals, getting into colleges and universities. How did that work? You know, what was the vendor contracting that was needed in order to be able to sell the Sodexo, for instance? The Vermont First program was adopted by Sodexo with a pledge to get to 20% local food sourcing. So there was just a lot of activity around, okay, how are we going to get to the target we had set of 10%? And it was amazing to see how much that having that target motivated people. So one of the things we did after we released the plan was we created what's called the Farm to Plate Network. And that is a network of organizations, not individuals. There's about 350 organizations, private sector businesses, nonprofits, government departments and agencies, capital providers, educators who have come together in order to implement the plan. Because one of the things that's really important to know about any system, you probably know this, is there's no one organization or one government agency that can solve these complex challenges or advance a series of complex programs and initiatives. So we took the approach from day one that the only way we were going to advance the food systems development in the state was if we were able to align the activities of dozens and hundreds of organizations and businesses, that we were going to be able to go farther faster if we worked together, if we used the resources, the expertise, the knowledge of lots and lots and lots of different people who were doing this work, who were wanting to grow more, sell more local food. And so we spent 10 years on a whole bunch of projects, bringing things to fruition. And then last April, we presented to this body this 10-year retrospective. So maybe I'll stop there before I go any farther there and just see where you're at.
Yeah, I should have started by asking if you wanted to hold questions until the end or until now, or is it okay if people ask questions as we go?
Please.
Okay, well, does anybody have a question? Representative Rice?
Yeah, I just wondering when you say local, what local means in this context, and then also if you are able to, if you have a representation of sort of like annual dollars kept in state that increase from 5% to 16% means, like how much more money is staying in local economy? Sure.
So it went from 5% was $114 million in sales, and 16% was $371 million. So it was like, what, 257 million or something like that in additional sales in 10 years. And that's an annual number, like it's grown in that way.
That's a lot of money. It's a $250,000 increase.
Yeah.
There's something like a 2.3 multiplier effect, to those dollars. So.
And that's, the 371 is without multiplier.
Correct. Yeah, that's purely just sales. Yeah.
The 11.3 billion is total sales of all food, regardless of local or not, plus indirect and induced. So it's the full direct, indirect, and induced impact of the food system in terms of our overall economy. It's a portion of sort of our gross state product.
And then the local, is that Vermont or is that region?
So that number is calculated based on Vermont plus 30. Which was you could say an interpretation of what was a legislatively defined definition for local. That definition now has changed. So the next, which we had sort of in our process of learning, we had some impact on the changes that were made to that definition. So the next iteration of the local food count will take into account the new definition. So there might be some changes in the amounts based on that definitional change. But yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, so the original bill was passed in 2007, I believe, and that had language of Vermont plus 30 miles. But there was a difference in interpretation about what does that 30 miles mean? Did the 30 miles mean like basically a bubble around the state? Or was it 30 miles from the point of origin? So the Attorney General's office had one interpretation, and we had another that was more of the cloud around the state. But because of those discrepancies, we were all encouraged, and the agency led on updating that definition. So the new plan and the data tracking we will be doing in this decade will be based on that definition. The numbers that are in here are based on the old definition. Got it?
We had the general counsel in this morning, and Representative O'Brien actually asked, maybe anticipating this discussion, just about that legislation. And so good, this is really actually.
Yeah.
Other questions?
So what Jake and I wanted to do was, with that little background history lesson of sorts of what has come before, is to orient you to these two documents, because we are not an advocacy organization. And because this body of work was set forth by an act of the legislature, we have always taken the position that we are in service to you all. So we think of we position ourselves, unlike other nonprofits that might be coming in to talk with you, for instance, as being a resource to you as well, to provide you with data about trends, what's going on in the food system, where we're hearing on the ground there are challenges that maybe it's really be a good one for you guys to address in the legislature, where we see investments that would be really timely to make, and be able to answer whatever questions that might be arising as you're hearing testimony from other folks, for instance, and really grounded in what the data has been saying. So think of us as a resource for you whenever you need us. It could be in a formal this way, or just give us a call or send us an email. And if you have a question about something, we're happy to answer that. Okay. So what we did, and so because we have statute, we really take very seriously this notion of the legislature asked us to do a 10-year plan. So we're keeping data from day one to be able to, at the end of that 10-year period, be able to report back, well, how did we do? And the results-based accountability as a metrics framework was first starting around 2011, 2012, so we took that very seriously. And so when the time came where the 10-year horizon was starting to end, in 2019, we came back to the legislature and said, do you want us to keep going? And so Farm to Plate Investment Program was reauthorized in 2019 to do a second 10-year plan, which is what this is. So I'm going to walk through just a few ways of how to orient you to the 10-year trends and the 10-year retrospective. And then Jake's going to walk through how do you use this document? Because unlike most other sectors, and also definitely unlike most of your other committees in this body, you don't have the benefit of something like this. So this is our gift to all of you as policymakers, to be able to give you the kind of background and information that will be hopefully very helpful to you as you consider important bills before you. And Representative Lepsky, the Forest Future Roadmap project, as you know, is intended to provide a similar kind of a roadmap or a plan for the forest products industry. And that'll be coming to you in January, that the Department of Forest Parks and Rec will be delivering to you. So this body next year will have something probably not as thick as this, but you will have something substantive to work from next year on that sector. Okay. So the first part of this retrospective just provides a little context and history. I won't go into that now. I pretty much already have covered a lot of it. But on page 7, we developed this graphic. It was probably one of the first things we did because we needed to help orient people like, what is a food system? Because back then, everybody used the language of just agriculture. And agriculture is really tied very closely to farm inputs and production. And then in the case of, in terms of farmed, on-farm value-added processing, for instance. Some farms do their own distribution. Some farms do, like farmers markets, they're retailing direct to consumers. But there's a lot more businesses that are part of the food system than just the legal status of being a farm. So we were tasked by the legislature to look at all forms of agriculture, all forms of food, organic, conventional, value-added, commodity, like the whole gamut. So we don't come, when we present this, we're not coming with a particular like, oh, you got to do organic or like that's all you can do, right? We are tasked with, and we take very seriously, exploring all forms, right? Because we need it all. So this diagram is really central and it's very intentionally laid out with the food system businesses in the center of it. Because without the businesses, we wouldn't have the food that we have. And the outlying circle are what we think of as the support system that enables and provides a lot of support to the private sector folks. So whether that's in the form of the various government agencies that set the regulations, whether that's the nonprofit advocacy organization that helps to shape what you might consider for policy, whether that be food hubs that distribute food, farm schools that might be sourcing local food. There's a whole range, and you all obviously are part of that support system too as policymakers. So we really wanted to try to orient people to thinking about like, who are we in service to? And then we take that lens very seriously. So on page 10, there's another diagram that we developed, which was how we thought about this network that I was telling you about, 300 to 350 organizations. And we grouped into teams, what we called working groups, to work on specific areas of the food system that really needed more attention. So there was a group, for instance, that was in doing production and processing and really thinking about, well, what was the value added processing needs and how is that going? What's the technical assistance that's needed to support farms and small value added food businesses? In aggregation distribution, that group was really looking at, are there ways to aggregate food from small producers? And then how do you get that food to market in a more efficient way, right? We had a group that was looking at education and workforce development. We developed a food system career guide that provides, I don't even know how many actual careers are in that guide. Do you remember? Probably 100 or so more, I would say, careers in the food system, like all different types with their wage levels, their education and certification requirements. Where could you get that education? Well, description. And that's gone to guidance counselors and the CTEs around the state to try to help young people find their path towards being in the food system if they're interested, for instance. So we have a lot of projects that were really about supporting the overall evolution and an expansion of the food system that came out of these network groups. And there's a nice spread here that just gives you a little bit of an overview of some of the highlights from those years. You can take a look at that at your leisure. And then if you, pages, starting on page 16, we start getting into what some of the results were and the types of activities that took place and the results. And basically trying to answer the question on page 19, what's changed? Is Vermont better off as a result of this very focused work that's been done? And so some of the data that I was sharing about the scale of the food system of 11.9 billion, I said 11.3, it's 11.9 billion. And that food manufacturing alone is $2.93 billion in food manufacturing in this state. So it's a big sector. And I think for way too long, basically, definitely in 2009 and 2010, when we first started, like the whole economic development community, the regional development corporations, the Department of Economic Development, they didn't really understand the economic value of this sector. And they do now. You take a look at the thinkvermont.com website, for instance. What is showcased on the agency's website, the forward-facing, trying to attract visitors? It is all about agriculture, food, breweries, distilleries, cool products, maple, agritourism. Like that was not the case 10 years ago, probably. And so we now really have this amazing partnership because you all asked the agency, the Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of Agriculture to be working together. It really has made a difference in breaking down the silos between the two and seeing where the synergies can be. So starting on page 21 then, we provided some data on just trend data over a 10-year period, 12-year period, depending on when data is available. As you probably know, frustratingly, the Census of Agriculture only comes out every 5 years. And let's just say this, it's taken every 5 years. And then after it's done being taken, we have to usually wait 2.5 to 3 years before we get the data. So oftentimes the data is way out of date by the time we actually get to work with it and see what's going on. It's lagging, right?
Can I ask just then, the graph here showing 2007,
yeah,
12, 17, and we've heard a couple of instances, 2017 and 2022. Is the census taken 5 and 0 years?
Right.
I see, and then it's 2 years after that.
Well, no, it's on the 12s and the 7s.
So it's taken at 12.
But on the 2s and the 7s, sorry, the 2s and the 7s.
So there's a census right now that's the actual survey is out.
Yep, okay.
For 2022.
But it'll be sometime before
It'll be
2025.
probably be 2024. Yeah, when we start. Yeah,
we'll see it.
Spring.
I don't want to sound like I'm not paying attention. What do you do? I mean, all you do is aggregate data, or your think tank? What is it you do?
Right. So let me flip to what does the Jobs Fund do? Which page is that on?
And if you were going to get to that later, we can.
Well, but I think it'll be helpful. So on page 11, it sort of explains a little bit more. It's probably more in is it in the new plan better, you think? Where's the easiest way to?
I mean, I think our annual reports are probably a better reflection of the things that are happening year to year on a project and activity basis, whereas this is more of an aggregation of the data that those 10 years of activity reflects.
Yeah.
So you've done lots of different activities, and
Yes.
this is all of it.
Yeah. So, but in the most simplest way to understand what we're doing is we've been tasked with creating a 10-year plan, and this is the second one. So that means we have a whole process by which we collect data, we talk to people, stakeholders, and we write this document for you all. We manage this network of organizations, which involves a lot of specific projects that are determined in here makes most sense, that's going to advance the whole system. We have a newsletter, a website, and a number of other communications vehicles because it's our intention is, information is power. And so much of our current industrial food system is behind the curtain, so to speak. So a lot of our work is helping to understand how is the marketplace working or not working. And when we find out important ways in which it's not working, we pull together the right people to figure out, is there a way around that? Is there something we can do to change that up? So we know, just a quick example with our grocers, retail grocers training work, we know it's really hard for small grocers in particular, independent grocers, to source local food. So we have a program where we can cover the cost of it. So we raise the funding for it. We have an amazing consultant who will go and work with grocers to help them develop more of a local food program of sourcing and learning about where could I get this? I've got customers that want this product or that product, and helps bring those into the store and then merchandise it so that people can find it, right? So that's like one pretty substantive project that we do. And then we do collect the data. So we track the progress on the plan that we've moved forward. We also raise funding to support a lot of the projects that the network is doing. So it's kind of all of those things. We call it a backbone organization, and you could think of us as kind of like the holders of the totality of Farm to Plate, and then helping to coordinate and align the various, and in some cases direct other organizations that are doing work in the system.
So it seems to me, and I'm going to paraphrase, and tell me if I'm wrong.
No,
so
please.
let's say this was instead of being a state, it was a large grocery store chain that sold several $1 billion worth of produce every year. They have all kinds of internal devices and departments to record what's hot, what's not. You're kind of like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Along with the Agency of Agriculture, right?
So you're connected to a government.
We work really closely in partnership with the agency. There are certain things that it makes absolute 150% sense that the agency leads on, right? Not only on the regulatory, but on a lot of the market development, working institutions, the work that Christina did before becoming in her current position of working with produce farmers who are wanting to have certifications that they needed in order to be able to sell into the wholesale markets. They had a whole produce safety program, for instance, that they've managed. The Dairy Business Innovation Center, that the Agency of Agriculture gets all this federal money and is really doing innovative explorations and seeding of new approaches to really try to stabilize and strengthen the dairy industry. So there's things that make absolute sense for the agency to do. And then there's an awful lot of sense that it's helpful to have an outside of state government entity like us, like the Jobs Fund, to be able to do, because we can be very nimble and we can access foundation and other federal funds that the state government can't. So it's really a collaboration and a very intentional one.
Yeah.
Does that help?
To a point.
Yeah. I get it. It's always a question that's been hard to explain. And early on, everyone was like, well, so you just go to meetings a lot.
Like this one, right?
but there's actually a lot of really tangible projects that would not happen and be as impactful as they have been had it not been for people collaborating across organizations. Like, because we're just smarter when we do stuff together, right?
Yeah.
I will say that trying to put myself in Representative Templeman's position coming into the legislature for the first time, there's a mind-boggling array of organizations that are quasi-governmental, that are agency, non-agency. It's extremely confusing, a lot of overlap. You described yourself, the roles that you play on other boards, and it will take, and I'm still trying to figure it out. So it will take us all some time to sort it through. And we won't figure it out today. And we won't, I will just say, even in the couple of hours we allotted, we won't have a thorough understanding of the Farm to Plate program either, I suspect. But we'll have the material and we'll have the websites to look at to go through it all.
Exactly.
Representative Lipsky.
Yeah, thank you. Ellen, on the charts on page 21, it's not critical, but when I think of the world, I think in terms of biomes. And prior to the last 380 or 400 years, all of Vermont was in a deciduous northern hardwood forest type. The notions of succession that we're aware of in New England are a result of changes of land use and abandonment of land use. So it was obvious to me why forested land was the only category in these bar charts that increased as opposed to decrease. That's just an overview of how I look at the natural world of ecological biomes. But my question to you, with that in mind, the trends that have been decreasing with agricultural land, how disturbing should this be for our collective goals of a vibrant agriculture or food farm to table, feeding the populations?
I think it's actually probably one of the most important things to keep attention on, focus on, track on. If we cannot secure the farmland of this state, secure it truly for farm production, we will increasingly find ourselves struggling to being able to feed ourselves. As climate change becomes more and more destructive, and more fires in the West, and the drought that's in the Midwest, and everything that's happening around the country because of climate change, the land is finite, right? We can't grow more. Vermont is Vermont, right? So if we don't secure our farmland for agricultural production, we will be losing the ability to, as time goes on, to feed ourselves in the way that we want to feed ourselves. So accelerating the rate at which farms are conserved, and or if they're not conserved, there's clear succession plans so that those farms stay in farm production, is critical. We when I come in, hopefully in the future, Chair so desires to talk about this New England Feeding New England, we've actually calculated through the modeling that's been done that across New England, in order for us to get to 30% regional food production for consumption, we actually need to bring online 953,000 more acres of farm production. Now, some of this is grass-based livestock, but a lot of it is more vegetables, more fruit, more grains. And so where is that going to come from? No, I'm sure you've spent time driving around the suburbs of Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island. I mean, they have some farmland, but they don't have what Maine and Vermont have, and even New Hampshire doesn't have a lot left. So if we're really thinking about how do we position food security from the standpoint of being able to secure the food supply to feed us some percentage, 25%, 30%, whatever, we have to actually expand the number of acres in agricultural production. So we can't lose what we already have, and we actually need 953,000 more.
How many?
953, to call it 950,000 more acres across New England, right? And where is that land most likely going to be? It's going to be Vermont and Maine.
Roughly 1 million acres.
Roughly a million acres.
Yep, and
To get
that's
to-
New England.
Yes.
Vermont would be expected to bear larger percentage than, yeah, okay. Representative Templeton.
So to achieve your goal, maybe this isn't the what has to happen, but it seems that you're gonna have to deforest land.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
I don't have the maps yet back from we have a map maker that's gonna be overlaying population with current land cover, and also where is the actual prime ag land, to be able to look at that. There's about 450 or so thousand what's called idle farmland acres that are just, they might be in a field, right? They're being brush hogged so that they don't go back to forest, but they're not really being utilized. So it's bringing that acreage back into production, which has its challenges because a lot of it's been broken up where there's suburbs around it or something, or housing developments around it. It's hard to get a tractor in there to till or whatever it is. But then there's also 550 or so acres, 50,000 acres or so of land that was in farms that has started to go back to forests. Early succession, yes, where it's going to need to be brought back.
And how many acres was that?
It's rough estimate of around 550,000 in that. So we're not talking about wholesale cutting down of forests, as we know that will be a hot button issue. We're saying of the farmland that is out there, there are opportunities to bring back into production land that had always been in agriculture. Right?
Representative Lipsky.
It's just an observation that one of the pressures that Vermont and many other rural states experience in the pandemic and post-pandemic is the the demand for housing, both workforce, sustainable our economies, but also sort of a climate migration that has been attracted to the state of Vermont, which is arguably one of the most friendly climates to be sustainable with regard to water.
Yes.
So, for local families or young families, just finding a place to live, buy, build a homestead is a huge economic challenge, given these outside migration trends. So it's just an observation. It's an additional challenge to achieving the goals that.
Absolutely, which is why we really kind of want to sound the alarm bells around the need to secure the land base, because we are facing those kinds of climate migration pressures, and just also the need because of the climate change modeling of more rain events, of higher amounts each time, to really make sure that we are doing a lot more to improve the quality, the health of soil, to be that sponge, to be able to accept more of these heavy rain events and those kinds of things.
And just to point out, because Henry had pointed out earlier, the Vermont VHCB, because I did serve on a land trust for years, and we focused and expanded our strategic plan to include working land.
Yes.
And have had great success, particularly focusing on conserving ag land, which the VHCB was very instrumental, partnerships with other land trusts.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And we need to accelerate the pace is part of the challenge we face. It's not happening fast enough. Given the pressures that you were talking about, they're coming so fast that it can take 2 years to conserve a farm property.
Absolutely.
We don't have 2 years to do that. We need more funding available more quickly to be able to get under purchase and sale agreements faster.
I think the other thing to pay attention to, and I think this committee hopefully will hear more about, is not just the need for conservation, but is the price of land and the ability for young beginning farmers to access that. So, acquiring 10 acres now is much different than acquiring 400 acres in the 1960s when a lot of these dairy farms, even before that. So there is also a mismatch now of when land becomes available, say through, a dairy farm is selling off a herd and looking for a buyer, there aren't, buyers who can afford the price of that, or you might have a vegetable farmer who only needs 5 acres of that. And so you've got a situation where there's, a mismatch in the market of what's being sold and what farm buyers are able to actually afford. And so I think that's another critical element here, is how do we help finance or reduce the capital cost of land for farmers? Because creating a business model where land is basically sinking it, the price of land is sinking it is a hard business to run. So.
Representative O'Brien, did you want to ask a question?
If it would help, I was thinking, you have a quote from Ella Chapin here now, Representative Chapin, who, was the former director of VHCD's Farm and Forest Viability Program. We often saw her in review. So can you just describe how you would work with someone, with that program? Because one of the lanes you travel in is the forest economy too. So how do you get the best out of each other instead of saying oh my God, we're doing the same thing, right?
Well, part of it is just having adjacent but different missions, right? The Farm and Forest Viability Program provides technical and business assistance to farms and primarily primary forest products businesses. And that is in the form of working with consultants and staff of other organizations to do business planning, and to be, some cases, doing some R&D, feasibility study, market research kind of a thing. It's a very specific and very important piece of the puzzle, right? Because any farm or food business or any forest products business, they go through life cycles, right? They're startups at some point in their life, right? And then they expand, they become a little bit more mature. And then at some point, they might even get really big, and they're at a point where they need to either reinvent themselves or they need to improve their processes in some ways. And all through that business life cycle or farm's life cycle, it's really helpful. I mean, it's really bears truth that if you work with some people from the outside of your business and have outside eyes on what you're doing, and you actually spend some time working on your business or on your farm and not just in it, that you tend to have greater opportunities in the marketplace, better profit margins, better quality of life, because you're just doing your job in a more impactful, strategic way, right? And you're working on the right stuff. And so their program really provides access to people for no cost, for farmers and some food businesses and then some forest products businesses to get that business planning support. But whereas our work with Farm to Plate is really to take a look at the whole entirety of the entire food system and find where we should be advancing certain initiatives, because there's opportunities in the marketplace. So, I mean, if you take a look at, for instance, on page 25, you can see that the vegetable farming value of production is increasing. Meat sales have been increasing. On the next page, one of the things that we talked on page 26, one of the things we talked about was the importance of meat processing. There was a lot of small livestock producers that were having long wait times to get their animals to the slaughter facility. And we did a lot of work in the early days of Farm to Plate to bring the processors into the conversation with livestock producers in order to help both understand each other's business models. Like, the processor didn't really usually understand what the margins look like for the producer, and the producer didn't understand that to run a processing facility, you kind of had to do it year round, not just when most of the harvesting was taking place, right?
So
hang on a second. Just Mike, you had a question.
It's Yeah, but it's separate, so.
Okay, yeah.
So you probably know that knew that I needed small ruminant slaughter facilities before I knew I needed it.
Correct.
Got it.
And so we bring people together from different parts of the supply chain to talk about, well, what are the barriers? What's getting in the way of doing that? And, you know, the Agency of Agriculture is always at the table for those conversations because they regulate meat and they're interested in growing the meat industry more. So it's what can they do? What can processors do? What we have been working with the Vermont Technical College to help them get to a point where they can have an on-site meat processing lab to train the next generation of meat cutters because the processors desperately they have openings. You know, last year there was one of the major processors had 10 openings for meat cutters in their plant.
Yeah.
Right. So we can facilitate those kinds of conversations in a neutral, like, let's just roll up our sleeves and get it done kind of a way, and bringing people together who, you know, are busy running their businesses. But they'll come to a meeting like that when they know that there's, you know, a grocery store chain that is wanting more local meat supply, and there's processors in the room, and there's capital providers in the room. Like, we're bringing them all together. Then all of a sudden, there's a reason to come to that meeting and start figuring out how do we break up these bottlenecks. And that's a big role that we play.
Why don't we hear Representative Rice's question, and then I think maybe we should let you wrap up at least the first half of the first volume.
Yep.
And we have a sort of an informal policy of taking a break every once in a while.
Yeah, and then we can shift to the plan. Yep.
If when there's a natural point, maybe it's when you're before Jake, maybe we'll take a break and.
Perfect. That's what.
But don't feel rushed. We actually have lots of time. So, but I want to make sure you have chance.
Thanks.
I'm just sort of related to the idea of these different organizations and making sure they're working together, but not on the same. I'm wondering. So there's 30 by 30 in
New England
production, and then there's similarly the initiative to preserve 30% of forest by 2030. So there are these different plans for forests and farmland. There's obviously need for housing. There's need for renewable energy generation. All of these things take land, of which there is a finite amount. And I'm just wondering if there's any one place where all of those things are being watched and coordinated to say, yes, we need to be growing food, having forests, generating energy, housing people, and making sure they can all happen together.
Officially, no. I mean, I think those of us who are in various sort of domains, so to speak, like the food domain and the forest domain, like our organization, you know, we don't do housing, but we do renewable energy, forest products, and food systems. So we are just naturally paying attention to that and understand those points of potential conflict, you know, of competition for available resources and land. Right?
And you understand housing because you need 10 places for the 10 meat cutters.
Exactly. Yeah. But, you know, more and more, and this is the challenge that I think all of us in society today, but it's, I think, particularly pronounced within the executive branch of state government and the legislative branch, is that for a long time, you guys could probably like stay pretty narrowly focused on like advancing just the food system and like, yeah, it's pretty good. But now we are all collectively learning at the points of intersection, sort of those Venn diagrams that overlapping between housing, childcare, education, workforce, forest products, you know, working lands, all of these systems are actually intertwined, and they all matter to each other in different ways. I mean, we didn't, you know, 5-6 years ago, there wasn't really anybody talking about workforce housing for farm workers, right? Is that a housing issue or is that a food system issue? It's both. So that is, I think, this next decade in particular's focus definitely for us. But I think I would argue it's going to be one of more and more for this body, the legislature, to be learning about how do you pass good policy, support good programs, fund the right things across these different domains because of their way in which they interact with each other. And that's tricky.
I think that's a great question, and I thought you were going to say, well, we are responsible for that.
No, that was bad.
We're a staff of 12.
150 of us.
Yeah.
But, and I think that, I mean, this has actually been a really useful conversation, I think, in terms of when we're thinking, we'll be looking at housing bills.
Right.
And, you know, we all know that, and gives us another point of reference for how, you know, how to think about the importance of housing here versus there. So, okay, well, why don't we let you?
Yeah, so I'll just wrap up this section before taking a break, just so like on page 27, I mentioned the local food purchasing. There's a graph there. So if you want to know the numbers of local food sales, there's a little write-up about that, but a nice graph. On the next page, page 28, for instance, you can see what's been happening in the direct to consumer. So that would be like farmers markets and community supported agriculture. You can see that between 2017 and between 2010 and 2017, there's a pretty sharp curve where people were much more interested in going to farmers markets and having a CSA share. And then that started leveling off a little bit. So those are the kinds of things we take a look at the data like, well, why is that happening?
And
right? Well, some of it is a feeling of that there's a sort of saturation, that there's too many farms for the number of consumers that want to buy in that form. Some of it is the novelty has worn off. There's a convenience factor of, you know, farmers market's only at my town on Tuesdays from 2 to 5. And, you know, like that's just not convenient, right? So there's lots of different reasons. But the point is that by providing this information to producers, it also helps. I mean, they have an intuitive feel for that. They sort of know, oh, my sales are down this year over last year. But to be able to see it in trend form, I think can be very instructive in terms of planning for the future, right? Institutional sales, we were making great headway on page 29 in institutional sales. And then, of course, the pandemic happened, and in 2020 that fell off because all the institutions were closed. So schools and colleges, universities, all those sales dropped.
Hospitals went up.
Yes. But 2020, hospitals went up for sure. And that's in part because we have fantastic people in leadership roles in our hospitals who are very committed to local food sourcing, and they work together on that. Diane Emery from UVM Medical Center, for instance, has been a nationally recognized leader in getting more local food sourced into hospitals, as well as organics. So anyways, this, you know, on page 32, there's a graphic about the employment and in what ways between farm labor, farm operators. Obviously, food retail is the largest component of jobs in the sector. Food manufacturing jobs have increased over time. And then it's not just any job. We want to see livable wages happening in our food system employment area. And so we keep a tabs on where is the livable wage in Vermont compared to what are different occupational titles for different types of jobs that exist. We cover issues around food security and the ability of people to actually access any food. And then I will say on page 36, again, this might be another, Mr. Chair, an area that you want to spend a little time learning more about, is what we call the capital continuum. It's sort of all the different forms of capital that are available to businesses at all scales, all types of businesses, and understanding the differences between them. Because as businesses grow, as I was saying, they get more mature, you want to access the right form of capital for what your business needs at that time. And many people don't know about that, and so they sometimes take on the wrong type of capital, and it can really mess up their business. So one of our colleagues who runs the Flexible Capital Fund developed this continuum and wrote the chapter in the plan on capital, access to capital. And she's fantastic at walking through these different forms of capital, what their purposes are, their uses. And so if that's something of interest, her name is Janice St. Ange. She would be happy to come over and take a look. She lives in Stowe, one of your constituents. Yes.
I made a note.
Yes. So, and then just finally in the retrospective, just so that you have a sense of over a 10-year period, we aggregated up all of the funds that were spent in essence to try to get to at least 10% local food sales, which, as I said, we got to 16%, and to expand and grow jobs and the economic impact of the sector. And so I think that, for the state of Vermont, put in over that period of time 1.6 million. I think that's a pretty darn good return on investment. And we were able, through that, because of the state putting in funds, it really did enable us to leverage other funding sources. The foundation community, for instance, where we raised 3.4 million from foundations over that 10-year period, they would not have come in with the kind of funding support had it not been for the state of Vermont and you all appropriating every year some funding for this program, because they saw that was the state's investment and they thought that was appropriate. So this just gives you a sense of the 10 years of what we've been able to pull off. And that's a sliver of the totality of all of the organizations that are part of the Farm to Plate Network and what they're mobilizing in terms of money to, whether that's Hunger Free Vermont and the Food Bank, or it's the Sodexo, or it's the Intervale Center in Burlington, or Food Connects down in Brattleboro. All of those organizations, they have their own budgets too. So it is quite a large effort, and through collaboration, I think we're making those dollars go farther and more strategically deployed for greater impact. So.
Good. Well, when we come back, then we'll switch over to Jake and we'll hear about the next 10 years and
what you should be focused on in the next couple of years.
Okay, good. Right. All right. Well, let's come back at when that clock says 5. When the big hands on the 5.
Hands on the 5.